Hi everybody. I'd like to make a quick guidance video for this unit on conditional statements to help you to look through the problems and to try and give you some guidance to help you get through some of them. Conditional statements can be a bit of a tricky unit, having finished variables now, moving on to conditional statements. So let's take a look at the assignments I've given you. So here in this conditional statements unit, again, there are 4 programming problems to do and the case study. Now the case study, now if you are in my in-class or whether doing this through InformNet, you're going to be doing the same assignments. The case study might actually be a good place to start. Although it does have code from part 1 of the unit and part 2, at least you'll be getting started. It is a bit of a long case study, but let's start on problem 1 of this unit. So problem 1 is actually probably one of the tougher ones. Not necessarily the best one to start with, but it doesn't have a lot of code, but it is a little bit tricky. So you're going to build this interface and definitely want to look at the hints here, okay? So choice of variables is important, a local versus a global variable. So at this point, I assume you know what variables are, having done the variables unit, and the difference between a local and a global. Decimal values on the test scores, that's a good hint. That should allow you to choose which type of variable you're dealing with. However, the number of scores will be a whole number, okay? You use message box, and this is probably the biggest hint that you need to do that first example to really understand how to do this problem. Some of you, especially in the online course through InformNet, are going right to the assignments without trying the examples. And that's a bad mistake. The examples are, to me, the best way to learn how to do this stuff. So you definitely want to do the examples because a lot of the questions I'm getting would have been answered if you actually had done the example itself. Okay? And then there's even a little flow chart here that could help you just sort of understand the problem itself. But let's also assume you didn't know how to do average, right? So this is also something you could certainly look up, how to calculate, okay, an average. So, right, the average is add up all the numbers and divide by how many numbers there is. So what you would do is you would build your design. I've already pre-built my design here. You would name everything. So I've already named everything. Everything's well named. This I assume you now know from not only the previous unit, but even the unit before that. Build your design, name all your objects, and then go in and code. But for this one, it would definitely be helpful to take a look at that first example if you had done it. So in the first example, if you were to look at the code, okay, you would have seen in the code 2 global variables right in the example, okay? There they are. Plus, another thing you could have done is you could have tried this program by downloading it. And what I'm again doing there is I'm going to the unit assignment demonstrations. This is available on both websites, right? Demonstrations. And then I've downloaded the program and then I've run it to try it. So I run it. So I put in a score, 76.5, enter it into my database, or the collection of scores. So a score was just entered. Then let's say I got a 50. I enter that score. So now I got a 75 and I got a 50. It's adding them together, okay? If I enter a score over 100, so 105, it tells me that the score must be under 100, and it doesn't count it. So now when I click the average, it was just the average of the 2 scores I entered. I can reset it and do it again. This time I'll enter 50, and then another 50. And the average, as you can see, is just 50. It ignored the scores from before. Okay, so now I know how it works. Having read all that, looked at the flow chart, more importantly was the hints from the example. Another thing you can look at is, as it says here, for additional hints, look at the presentation. The presentation has the code from the example, but it annotates it a little bit. So it looks through it and says, oh, okay, so this was in the example, but you might need this in problem 1 or problem 2. You might need to write an if-else. So there's a clue right there. I need to write an if-else. What other clues could I draw? Oh, here, 2 global variables would be needed in problem 1. So right there, it's telling you that you could take right from the example, okay, these global variables could be put directly right into your problem, okay? But you got to adapt it. Just because it's an example doesn't mean it's going to be exactly the same. So looking at another hint here from that first problem, the test scores should include decimal values. So in our example, we just did integer values. But to me, the sum would be a double, right? It would be allowing you to enter decimal values. The count, though, could I enter 2.5 scores? I don't think so. And that's what it says right here. The number of scores will be a whole number. So an integer works good for that. Okay, so now I've got that done. What else could I learn from some of these hints, from some of this demo code? Well, here you can see, remember what's in the text box, make a decision. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. I could actually take a lot of this code over to the enter value button, whoops, and put it in there, okay? What's in the text box? Okay, well, this time I've changed the name of my text box to txt score. Not a big deal, I can change that. This thing does not have any labels, so this line isn't going to make sense, so I'll take it out. But the rest of this looks pretty good. If a value is nothing, you need to enter something. That's really not necessary for this problem. So maybe I'll move this down a little bit, where I take the number and convert it, move that up, and make it a double. And instead of just calling it number, let's make it what it is. This is their test score. Oops, I'll call it score. So in these first two lines, I got what's in the text box, converted it to a test score. Now with my decision, what is the decision I need to make? Okay? What is the message box I need to show? Well, reading the problem, the decision I need to make is that the score must be under 100. Okay? So I'm going to incorporate that into my decision making. I'm done with this sort of example here. So instead of this decision, the decision should be the score. If it's greater than 100, then I'm going to display a message box saying something like it showed in the example. Scores must be under 100. Okay? Do I need to exit the program? No, I don't need to do that. So I'm going to get rid of that line. So again, you're taking the example and you're modifying it. You're changing it up so it fits kind of the problem you have now. Okay, so now here's the code, sum equals sum. It's not number anymore, it's score. Count equals count plus 1. I'm counting it. So these things that I did in the example definitely work for this problem. Now I'm just going to remove some of the comments here, which I'd put in the example, but just to show you just the core of the code here. Let's try it. Let's see what we have so far. So I'm going to enter a score, 50. Okay, it entered it, I think. Let's try a different score, 75. Looks like it entered it. Let's try a score that's over 100, 200. Okay, there's my box, which I wanted to happen, and that's working pretty good so far. A couple little things you could do when you enter that score into the box. Maybe after you're done entering it, you could clear it out. So maybe I'll add that as a last line of code here. Txt score.text equals nothing. So I clear it out. Let's try that. 50, enter. Oh, it cleared it out. That's what I wanted. I'm going to try one other little thing that's actually not in the, this is just a little bonus for this video. This is a neat line I'm going to show you. Txt score.focus. This is a line that isn't in the notes. I'm just going to show you this right here in the video, and I'll show you what it does. Enter. By focus, it puts the cursor, the flashing cursor, back in the box, allowing me to type in the next score immediately. So it just sets what's called the focus of the program to that. So now I can just keep entering scores. If I go over 100, tells me that, and it clears it out, looking good. Okay. Now, some of these buttons I assume you know how to code. I assume you know how to code an exit button. You've done that before, okay? But now what about the average? How am I going to figure out the average? Well, now I can again look at this. It's the number of scores added up. Hey, isn't that my sum variable? My sum variable is me adding up all the scores together. Divide by how many? Well, isn't that my count variable? The one I'm using to count up each score. I have two global variables that are essentially doing the job of getting ready to calculate average. So why don't I figure that out? The average equals the sum divided by the count. These are two global variables, sum and count. So I don't need to create them. Now I need to just display them, display this number. Once again, I'm going to use a message box to do this, which also is one of the hints, right? One of the hints on that assignment was, if you forget how to use message box, check your notes, right? Notes are always going to be available to you. So you're going to look at that content section. You're going to look through there. If you need to, you can even directly go to some pieces of code that would help you to figure out, for example, how to write a line of code to create a message box, right? So you would see that code sort of quickly by looking through the notes or the videos to get there, okay? All right, so what do I want to do? I want to say the average is this average. Okay, let's see how that works. See if it works very similar to the demo I tried. So I'm going to enter a 50, I'm going to enter another 50, I'm going to enter a 60. The average is, oh, it calculated it. I'd still need to reset, okay? What if I entered 200? It says it won't be, and the average still stays the same because it didn't count that score. Okay, this is how I would approach that first problem. You would still have to do the reset button. I'm not going to code it, but I'll give you a couple hints. You're going to need, what do you need to reset in this? There's nothing visual to reset. We don't have to turn off a picture. We don't have to clear out a text box. Well, I guess we could, which we've already done. You could add this line here to clear the text box. I don't think that's actually necessary, but you could. There's no labels to clear out, but what you do have to do is reset the variables. Which variables? Probably the global variables. To, what do I reset numbers to? Well, to 0. Okay, so that's what you would do to reset this. So try and figure out what I mean by that. Try and get it working. Obviously, you got to get your exit button working as well, and that should get you through that first programming problem, which I think is one of the harder ones. All right, so with that first one done, you would then also use a little bit of that as a hint to move on to the second programming problem. Now this one is a lot more work to do, okay? It's a lot more design work to do. As a matter of fact, my design that I've sort of whipped up here, I didn't even bother, doing all the work with it. And it's got some more sort of code to look at as well. But rather than do this one, I'm going to give you a couple hints for how to approach this one. Definitely read this section up here, which has some information about prices and some of the stuff that's going on there. You can definitely look at the design there. It's got a little bit of work to build with the design. You're going to need several labels in here. Some students like to use 2 labels. You don't really need to use 2 labels, but whatever works for you. Okay, little text boxes and stuff like that. But it's on the second page of this where you're going to get a series of hints, right? So same hint about local versus global variables. Hint, this one really doesn't need any global variables. Everything happens when you click that calculate button. So you can build all your variables, do all your work, and then get rid of all those variables, so they could all be local. They don't really have to be global variables. Now there are different ways to approach this problem, so I'm not saying you can't use global variables. It depends how you code it. Okay, money includes decimals, so I'm telling you a hint here which type of variable, integer versus double. If it's money, uses decimals, you should pick that. You do not need to round off things. Some students ask me that, well, how do I round it off to make it? That's nothing I wanted in this problem. That's a little more complicated. Message box, check the notes. First example has a lot of clues in it. Let's take a look at, again, you can see here some of the clues. So this one here, for example, would be good in problem 2, it says. So an if-else statement, right? In problem 2, how to check to see if something's checked or not, right? That would be definitely useful in this one because I'm going to be checking off checkboxes and radio buttons. So checking to see if something is checked would definitely be something I would need to do in this problem. Okay, so there's a hint. Next hint. Here is some pseudocode. So what I've presented here for this one, knowing has a lot of challenges to it, I've essentially taken the code that I used to solve it and translated it into just pseudocode, which means it's not really code, but it's kind of a way you can interpret ways to do this. Now, this isn't the only way to solve this problem, but it's a way I've laid out here. Now, here's some hints for this. You can see here I'm saying all of this code goes in the calculate button. And then further on in this, I say all of this code goes in the reset button, okay? All right, so you're gonna have to interpret what I mean by create any needed constants and variables, values that aren't changing, values that will change. So hopefully you know how to make a constant, how to make a variable, the style of the code, the constants use all capital letters, etc. That should be stuff you learned from the previous unit. You want to use this first page to help you figure out what is a constant. So, the price of a large isn't changing. The price of mushrooms isn't changing. The amount of taxes isn't changing. These would be constants. What will be changing? Well, the subtotal will be changing. The real total will be changing. The amount of cash. So you have to kind of interpret all those things. So you might want to just kind of get started with that. As you start to go through the problem, you might realize you need to add a few more of them up here or remove a few of them from up there, okay? Now, here, when it says if the size is large, how do I know what I mean by that? Well, if I've checked off large. So you're going to have to kind of interpret the code from the hints and the example there to get to that. If the green peppers have been checked off, if the mushrooms, okay? Then as you go further in, there's some little math you're going to have to do, how to calculate the taxes, how to calculate the total, how to get the text out of the text box, how to calculate things like that, and then a final if statement to see if they gave you enough money. So my advice would be to follow this pseudocode, try and get some stuff in there. If you get stuck, you can email me your code and say, well, here's where my code has got an error, here's where I'm stuck. But at least you get you started on this problem. Okay, so that's problem 2. All right, once you're done problem 2, you would then go on to the second half of this unit, part 2 of the unit, and you would do the second example. Definitely, again, important. So the second example, you would do this one. This is the first example. You would do the second example, and all its code that goes with it. So this code makes, for example, use of the else if statement. It also uses this fancy and symbol and the fancy or symbol, if you think those might be useful to you. In the hints, okay, now looking at the second example, okay, you can see here from the second example that maybe problem 3 and problem 4 could use some global variables. Okay, so maybe making global variables. Form load code might be needed in problem 4. So in part 2, you'll learn about what this code called form load is. Making random numbers, that would be necessary in the third problem because it's a slot machine problem. Okay? And then using else if statements could be used in problem 3 and 4. So you're seeing that the second example definitely gives you some hints on how to do stuff, including making random numbers. So now you go on to do the third programming problem. In my opinion, the third one, it's actually the easiest one in the whole unit. It's not the shortest, it's got some design to it, and it's got some work to it, but it's definitely, in a lot of ways, the easiest. So let's see how it would work. So I'm going to try a demo of problem 3. Download it, try it before I program it, see how it works. So if a student is 15, I enter them into the database. There's one student in grade 10, and I have one total student, okay? Now I put an 8-year-old into my database, and another 8-year-old, and another 8-year-old, and another 8-year-old. So now I have 4 students in grade 3, 1 in grade 10, and a total of 5 students in the entire database. I could reset it so they'll all go back to 0, and I can exit this program. So that's a demo of it. It's pretty simple, okay? So when I hit enter, what would I do? Well, I already know one of the hints I showed you, that this would probably need some global variables. Reminder from the previous unit, you make global variables if they're needed in more than one button. That's not really the case here. Every time I hit enter, I can create the buttons. Or, and this is the important one, if I wanted to always remember its values. So this is a database where it's always remembering, unless I reset it, how many kids are in each grade. So what I would do is I would make global variables for each grade. An integer, for example, for the number of kids in kindergarten, an integer for the number of kids in grade 1, etc., all the way up to an integer for how many kids are in grade 12. I would just make a bunch of global variables for each grade, okay? So it's not that complicated, but it's long, lots of variables there. And then when I enter into the database, I would do the stuff that you've been doing for a while now. I would read the text from the text box. I would convert to a number, in this case, which is the age. Age is a number. And then I would use a conditional statement to make a decision based on the age. Okay, so that would be my process, okay? To give you a little code for this, okay, string value equals txt age.text. I'm going pretty quickly here so you can see that. Int age equals convert dot to an integer, that value. Hopefully, again, having done this in the previous unit and in the previous couple problems, this is now getting a little easier. You're understanding this process. What would the conditional look like? What condition would I have here? Well, if the age equals 5, then this is a kindergarten student. So the number of students in kindergarten, K, that's my variable for kindergarten, equals that same number of students in kindergarten plus 1. This line of code where you're adding 1 to a variable in this way, you would have seen in the first example, and it really kind of is common code for that. Now, you'd also need to see this. So my label for kindergarten, or I called it grade 0, dot text would be equal to a bunch of words plus that kindergarten variable, okay? So let me just test that. I run this. I put in a 5. I enter it into the database. And there you can see it's now counting 1 student in grade 5. If I enter another few, it keeps the count going up because it's a global variable. It always remembers its value, okay? So, I haven't coded any exit button. Now, for this, okay, what we need is we're making multiple decisions. Okay? There's multiple ages. It's not one or the other. It's not just one thing. So, a hint given on this one is that the first example has some clues in it. But, oh, sorry, this is the one we just did. It's this one now. Okay? This has multiple conditions. It's repetitive. You'll need a lot of different variables. The second example has clues in it, because in that second example, in the clues of that we'd be needing some sort of else if statement here. So multiple decisions means you're going to use this thing you learn in part 2 called the else if, which makes multiple decisions. And that's how you would do that one, okay? I'm not going to do the code for you, just some guidance here. Reset, what do we reset here? What exactly are we resetting? Well, all the labels, and this is the big hint, which you would have learned from the first one, all the global variables. Okay, so look at the first one to get some hints on how you reset a global variable. But that's what you would do when you reset this database. You're going to know instantly as you test it if it works or not. So that's how I would approach the third one. Okay, so you now have hints and guidance for the first 3 programming problems. The final, which is actually one of my favorite programming problems, is this slot machine program. Okay, So let's download this one to try it. Let's download problem 4. Okay. Try it out. So every time you pull, it puts up 3 random numbers. Every time you pull, it takes away one of your 100 tokens that you start with. However, if you get all 3 numbers the same, for example, all 3s, I'm going to win some tokens. In this case, I'm going to win 12 tokens. So my tokens just went up by 12. And that's how this game is essentially played. So with that in mind now, what hints have I given you? Well, I've given you, again, just a few. Local versus global variables, message box. Second example had some hints. Here's a design hint on how to make your labels look like slots. It's just changing the border style and stuff like that, and you can be creative with that. And one option you could do, this is a hint that is one way you could solve this problem, is you could use this and symbol. Okay? All right, so moving on to this last one. Okay? Only one button to really program, the pull button. Okay? But again, maybe I'd need some global variables here, maybe. Okay? One thing I know I'm going to need is random numbers. So in that second example, okay, we do an example of random numbers. So I'm just going to steal a little bit of this code, how to make a random number, and put it into this pull button. Oops, of this this one here. Okay, so random equals new random. I'm going to make an integer called slot1 equals a random number between 1 and 6. And then I would display in the label. So I have a label, LBL slot1 dot text equals nothing plus slot1. Okay, let's see what this does. Just that alone. Taking from the example, okay, it's doing random numbers, but it's 1 to 5. And I wanted this 1 to 3. That's what this second number here represents. It's always one more. So if I go 1 to 4, okay, now we're cooking. Okay, and then obviously I would need to do this 2 more times. I need to make more slots and display it more times. And then I would make a decision. So think about what the decision you have to make. That's what an if statement does. It makes decisions. Do I win or not? That's the decision you're making. How do I know if I win? Well, if, and I'm just going to write this as a comment, if the slot 1 is 1 and slot 2 is 1 and slot 3 is 1, then I win. And how much do I win with that? Well, let's take a look at the thing here. So if all numbers are 1, they get 4 tokens. Oh, okay. So I'm just going to move the example out of the way now. So I'd win 4 tokens. That's how I would work it. But I have to make not just one decision. I have to make multiple decisions. This is something I learned in the previous one. Maybe I need an else if here. Do I win or not? So that's one way I decide. What about, and I'll say it this way, else if slot 1 is a 2, slot 2 is a 2, slot 3 is a 2. Well, then I would win 8 tokens. And then what if they're all 3s? 3 and a 3 and a 3, then I win 12 tokens. Okay? So I would need to update tokens. That means that tokens always remembers. That tells me maybe that tokens should be a global variable. Starting at 100, I actually know how many tokens. Update the tokens, update the label where the tokens are in. So there's a label out there that tells you how many tokens are there. Okay? This is kind of how I would approach this fourth problem. okay, is looking at some of those hints. I hope that will help you with the programming of this. And I hope that was a good set of hints for helping with this unit on conditional statements. If any of these hints is insufficient, email me, but try it first. Don't email me before you start anything. Email me or contact me once you kind of have something that you can at least try. All right, good luck, everybody.